All right, welcome everyone to this evening's screening of A Farewell to Arms. I'm Anthony Monta. I'm the Associate Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. I have the unenviable task of following Olivier Morel, who was a fellow of the Institute and who introduced the last film here in this series, which focuses exclusively on films about World War I. Olivier, in a beautiful baritone voice, sang verses of an unedited, unpublished song that the French soldiers sang in the trenches. It came from a guy that he interviewed before he died, one of the last survivors of the war, and I have no prayer of following that kind of performance. So I'm going to be a little more dry and academic, but I hope interesting given the context of this particular film this evening. Farewell to Arms, as I'm sure all know, is the first-person rendering of an American expatriate lieutenant serving in the ambulance corps of the Italian Army during the First World War. It was serialized in Scribner's magazine in 1928, and then Scribner's published it as a book a year later in 1929. It was Hemingway's first big bestseller, making him financially independent. It was also censored, and this is a topic that's going to come up later in my remarks, and was the topic of, in some fashion, in a large way, of Olivier's remarks as well. It was censored for foul language, and because of its treatment of the Battle of Caporetto, and its aftermath was prevented from being published in Italy until after the war, until after 1948. And of course, Hemingway, took a copy of the book and scribbled in all the bad words and sent it to James Joyce, apparently, who loved it. But despite the obstacles of censorship, the novel was adapted for the stage almost immediately in 1930 and made it to film in 1932, and that's the version that you're going to see tonight. At the time, Hemingway's novel was 3 years old, and so were talkies. So we have to cast our minds back to that point. So were talkies as the cinematic norm in American cinema. Paramount Pictures at this time, this is 1932, was almost bankrupt. Its deficit was on the order of some $16 million, which is paltry by today's standards, but sufficient to make Paramount's studio production head feel he had to resign. The studio bought the rights to the novel for $80,000. It enlisted a couple of screenwriters to do the screenplay. And then, very interestingly, it decided to hire Frank Borzage, a veteran and Oscar-winning director, to run the set. Gary Cooper, who was very popular by that time, would star alongside Helen Hayes, who, as you may know, went on to a very illustrious theatrical career, and Adolphe Menjou, who you may remember if you were here the last time for a screening. He played one of the generals in Stanley Kubrick's film Paths to Glory, so we'll see him again tonight. It was a pretty bold move by Paramount at this time and a significant gamble. The choice of Borzage as a director is also totally non-obvious in this context, given the style and tenor of this novel that I have here. And I thought I might read you a passage, but it might take too long. But you know Hemingway's style. It's very terse, it's very dry. According to Martin Scorsese, Borzage was a real romantic. He would weep as he directed his actors during the silent era of film. He came from a poor Catholic family in the American West. He was a pacifist. He was very anti-fascist, popular, interestingly, with the Surrealists. Not something you would expect if you know his work. And he became best known for what critics call the Borzage touch, right? Meaning a certain treatment of romantic love that was both unsentimental and beautifully luminous. Borzage was complicated. He was married unhappily 3 times, which might explain his romantic idealism. But again, as a director of this really gorgeous melodrama, he was hardly an obvious fit for Hemingway. The script, too, represented a pretty radical revision. Without giving anything away, you know that it would shift, of course, the first-person point of view to third-person, but it also profoundly changed the role of Rinaldi, one of the Italian figures in the film, and it suppresses certain historical events. I'm a literary guy, so it's always interesting for me to think about genre. Borzage himself didn't see much of an opposition between the genres of melodrama and historicism. Historical fiction, he thought that if you dramatized people in melodramatic domestic situations, they could still represent, powerful, and powerfully the conflict between real historical social norms and how people were caught up in them. So during the Depression, you'd think a film like this, which could have a small cast, which focus on a smaller domestic drama, would be less expensive to make than a big war picture like Kubrick's film. But you'd be wrong. A Farewell to Arms Tonight, back in 1932, cost $900,000 to make, nearly triple what Paramount had been spending on a single film. But the gamble paid off. They had a great marketing scheme. The film was a commercial and critical success. It didn't win Best Picture, but it won 2 Academy Awards for cinematography and sound. And at all of this, I'm sure you'll know, Hemingway, no doubt, snorted into his mojito. He was known to have been contemptuous of film in general, at least compared to his chosen métier, and if an adaptation were in any way to be endured by him, say for $80,000. He felt that the film had to proceed almost as a documentary, be totally faithful to the original, no additions, no modifications. When Paramount executives offered him to send him a print of the film, he told them to use their imagination as to where they should put it. And in a letter, he referred to it using, that were words for him, quite mild, like bastard and sabotage. And in response to a later film adaptation of his novel in 1957 by David Selznick, he referred to Selznick's work as pissing in your father's beer. So Hemingway was not too kind to this film. But there was one type of modification that even Hemingway had to exceed. And however sardonic he must have felt about the Borzage touch, about romance, he may have felt a twinge of sympathy for the conditions under which Borzage was beginning to have to work, and all filmmakers will have to work, and that's moral censure and moral censorship. You might recall that the film was made, this one, just as the motion picture production code was just starting to get traction. These were a set of moral guidelines and recommendations for the film industry. The key figure here was Will Hayes, a Presbyterian minister. He was enlisted by the studios to kind of deal with the poor reputation that Hollywood was suffering after the 20s, which was famous for lots of racy films and a more adventurous, approach to subject matter. So Hayes formed a committee back in 27. He identified subjects to be avoided and then subjects to be handled carefully. And the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, agreed to this, and the studios, who were fearing government intervention on all of this, went along with it. So there was what was called the Studio Relations Committee. It was set up to oversee its implementation. And you can imagine, in the Hollywood era, in the golden age of Hollywood era, this would be quite a job. But there was a Colonel Jason Jay put in charge of implementation in 1932. He had to review like 500 films a year with a tiny staff. He only had the power to recommend changes. He couldn't actually enforce anything. But this was when the censorship started to get traction. And obviously the code itself, with its pretty explicit Christian underpinnings, met, the usual suspects of objectors. Variety made the code public in 1930. The Nation ridiculed it. The Hollywood Reporter mocked it in 1931, and of course the Depression led film studios just to stay alive, to try to take whatever means they could to make films, films to arouse interest. And of course the film artists, creatively resisted all the limitations. Borzage's film that you'll see tonight was re-released twice and subject to the code's pressure more powerfully than what you'll see in this version tonight. In 1938, it was altered significantly by the successor to the Studio Relations Committee, the more powerful Production Code Administration, the PCA. The PCA regarded this film as immoral because of, quote, suggestive dialogue, lustful kissing, illicit sex was the operative word there, and lack of moral compensation. 10 minutes were cut and a wedding ring was added in its version. The second re-release occurred after Warner Brothers bought the film in 1946. They worked with the same 38 cut that was called all of those things, but it was considered morally objectionable for adults on account of suggestive situations and dialogue. Whatever one thinks of all of that, it's interesting to note that the code's existence made it possible for European films, and as somebody from a European film studies program institute, it made possible the introduction of more adventurous, more less inhibited European films into the US market. So that's when you start to get, particularly in the 60s, right after this, people like Godard. So tonight's film, which is the original 32 version, may represent an attempt to move, I think, out of the artistic environment that cultural historians have come to call high modernism, which is ironic, given that this is a film of a work of classic high modernism, Farewell to Arms by Hemingway. Does Borzegi's treatment of Hemingway's modernist classic take us backward into a pre-war mindset? I don't know. That's for you to decide, I think. Should we see the existence of the motion picture code as an attempt to reestablish a moral frame for art after 2 decades of moral and aesthetic, however you want to see that, fragmentation brought about by a war that shattered trust in so many areas of cultural life? The film has survived the pressures that have tried to deform or destroy it, and I guess it remains to you to determine whether the Borghese touch, with its combination of restraint, beautiful restraint, lovely cinematography, and belief in the transcendence of loving intimacy, remains convincing. So, enjoy.